He said it on a Tuesday. Not during a fight. Not after wine, not when he was tired. He said it the way people say things they've been thinking for a long time casually, like he was simply reporting the weather. I just feel like I could have done better. I was folding laundry on our bed. His shirts, actually. The blue one he wore to his firm's holiday party. The gray one I'd ironed 3 times because he said the collar never sat right. I set it down. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at him and said, "Okay." He blinked. He'd expected a reaction, I think. A plea. A question. Some version of please don't that he could either accept or reject depending on his mood. I gave him none of it. "Okay," I said again. And went back to folding. What my husband didn't know, what he had never bothered to know, was that I had stopped being the woman he expected me to be about 3 years before that Tuesday. He just hadn't noticed. We met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in Gastown. I was freelancing then, graphic design, UX work, whatever came in, and he was 2 years into an analyst role at one of the big banks downtown. He was impressive in the way that young men in suits can be impressive. Confident, well-spoken, with opinions about everything and the vocabulary to back them up. I was charmed. I won't pretend otherwise. We got serious fast. He moved into my apartment in Kitsilano after 8 months. My apartment, the one I'd been renting alone since I was 26. He paid half the rent when he could, and when his salary went through a rough patch after a restructuring at the firm, I covered the rest. It wasn't a big deal. We were building something together. That's what I told myself. Partners share the weight. That's what partnership means. We got married 3 years after that dinner in Gastown. Small ceremony at a vineyard in the Okanagan, 32 people, wildflowers, nothing over the top. His parents flew in from Halifax. My sister drove up from Kelowna. We danced to a song we both loved, and I genuinely believed, standing there with my hands in his, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. What I didn't tell him at the wedding, or for a long time after, was that 6 weeks before we got engaged I'd registered a corporation. A numbered company at first, then a proper operating company with a name I'd chosen carefully. I'd been freelancing long enough to know that the next step was something more: a proper studio, a team, a thing that could grow beyond just me. I had 2 anchor clients, a waiting list, and a business plan I'd written over 6 months of evenings while he watched hockey in the living room. I didn't hide it because I was ashamed. I didn't hide the scope of it because I was planning to leave. I kept it quiet because every time I'd tried to talk about it, the conversation had gone the same way. He'd listen for about 2 minutes, then pivot to something he'd read about the market, or a deal his firm was working on, or how a guy he knew from Queens had just made VP before 35. My work was, in his mind, a nice little side thing. A creative outlet. Something to keep me busy. "You're so talented," he used to say, in the same tone people used to compliment a child's drawing. So I stopped telling him. I kept my business account separate from our joint account, which, for the record, is entirely legal in British Columbia and something our accountant recommended anyway. I kept my incorporated company's financials where they belonged, with my accountant and my lawyer not on the kitchen table. He knew I worked. He knew I had clients. He thought I made somewhere around $60,000 a year, which was what I'd told him once early on, when that was roughly true. He never asked again. Men who believe they are the financial center of a household rarely audit the edges. By the time he told me he could have done better, my company had 4 full-time employees, a roster of 12 active clients, 4 of them national brands, and a revenue run rate that would have made his jaw drop. But he didn't know that. He knew I took calls from the second bedroom. He knew I had a nice laptop and went to conferences occasionally. He knew I sometimes worked late. He did not know what any of it was worth. The months before that Tuesday had been grinding in a way I couldn't easily name. He'd gotten a promotion in the spring, senior associate, a title that came with a modest raise and an enormous shift in his personality. He started talking about his career the way someone talks about a religion. Every dinner became a recap of something he'd navigated at work, some junior analyst he'd mentored, some client he'd impressed. I listened. I asked questions. I was genuinely happy for him. At first. But something started curling at the edges of how he spoke to me. Small things, at first. A comment about how I didn't really have deadlines the way he did. A joke at a dinner party in front of people about how I basically worked from home in my pajamas. A moment in September when a friend of ours asked how my business was going and my husband answered for me, "Oh, she keeps herself busy." I keeps myself busy. I sat very still at that dinner table and smiled, and when we got home I went into the bathroom and stood at the sink for a long time, looking at my reflection, trying to locate the woman he seemed to think he was married to. I didn't find her. What I found instead was a kind of clarity I hadn't expected. Quiet. Almost peaceful. I called my lawyer the next morning. Not to file anything. Not yet. I just needed to understand where I stood, what my company looked like as a marital asset in BC, what the disclosure process would involve, what the timeline typically looked like. She walked me through it carefully, because I had incorporated before the marriage, because my husband had never contributed to the business in any documented way, and because I had kept meticulous records for 6 years. My position was strong. Not untouchable but strong. I didn't tell my husband about that call. I went back to work. In October, a Toronto-based creative tech firm reached out. They had been acquiring smaller studios across the country: Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, building a consolidated portfolio ahead of what their CEO described in our first call as a very significant capital event. They were interested in my company. They had done their research, which meant they knew things about my revenue and my client list that I hadn't told them, because those things were discoverable by anyone who looked. My husband was not someone who looked. The first offer they brought to the table was not the one I accepted. We negotiated over 8 weeks, me, my lawyer, and a business broker I'd brought in on a referral. The firm wanted 70%. I held firm at 49. We landed at 53, which meant I retained just under half and stayed on as creative director for a guaranteed 3-year term. The final number, in Canadian dollars, was $9.4 million. I signed the letter of intent on a Wednesday afternoon in November, in a boardroom on Burrard Street, 3 blocks from the coffee shop where my husband and I had our first date. I took the elevator down alone afterward. I stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and breathed in the salt air coming off the inlet. I didn't cry. I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt like someone who had been walking a very long road and had just seen, for the first time, exactly how far she'd come. I went home and made dinner. The Tuesday he said it, the I could have done better Tuesday, was 2 weeks after I'd received the first wire installment from the acquisition. 60% of the total, paid on closing. The rest would follow in tranches over 18 months, tied to performance targets I had every confidence of hitting. I had not told him. I want to be clear about something. I was not being vindictive. I was not waiting for the perfect dramatic moment to blow up his world. The truth was simpler and sadder. I had tried, in small ways, for years, to bring him into what I was building. He had declined, repeatedly, to be interested. The version of me that existed in his mind was so fixed, so certain, that there was no room in it for the actual facts. I had learned, slowly and then all at once, that some people do not update their understanding of you not because they can't, but because the outdated version is more comfortable for them. He had built a marriage around a woman who kept herself busy. That woman was not me. So when he said it standing in our bedroom doorway, arms crossed, that particular expression he got when he'd been building up to something, I set down his shirt and I said okay, and I meant it in a way he couldn't yet understand. The next morning, I called my sister. She is 4 years younger than me and has never once in her life suffered a person who didn't deserve her time. She is the person I call when I need to say something out loud to make it real. It's done, I told her. She didn't ask what I meant. She said, "What do you need?" "Nothing yet. Just wanted you to know. I'm proud of you," she said, and I had to put the call on mute for a moment. I did not make a scene. I did not organize a dinner. I did not invite his friends to watch me present documentation of my net worth while a pianist played something ironic in the background. I know that story. I've read that story. And I understand the appeal of it, the symmetry, the satisfaction of watching someone realize, in real time, exactly what they dismissed. But I kept coming back to what I actually wanted, and what I actually wanted had nothing to do with making him feel anything. What I wanted was to be done. To close the account. To walk out of a version of my life that had been too small for me for a very long time. I met with my lawyer the following week and began the separation process. In BC, the Family Law Act requires a separation period before a divorce can be finalized. We would need to be separated for at least a year. My lawyer filed the initial documents. I made arrangements. I found an apartment in Mount Pleasant, a good one, with high ceilings and a kitchen that got morning light, and I signed a lease. My husband came home one Thursday evening to find me in the living room with 2 boxes and a calm expression. "I'm moving out this weekend," I said. "My lawyer has been in touch with yours. I'd like to keep this as straightforward as possible." He stared at me like I was a stranger. "You're serious," he said. "Yes." Because of one thing I said? I thought about that for a moment. About the dinner party in September. About 6 years of him summarizing me to other people in ways that required no input from me. About the slow, patient work of making myself legible to someone who had decided, very early on, that he already knew what I was. "No," I said. "Not because of one thing." He wanted to talk. He wanted to sit down and process and discuss what had brought us here. He is, at his core, someone who believes that most problems can be resolved with the right conversation. I had once found this quality admirable. "I don't think talking will help," I said, and I meant it gently. "I think this is just where we are." I spent that weekend moving. My sister came down from Kelowna. We rented a van and made 2 trips and ordered ramen from the place near my new apartment, and we sat on the floor of my half-empty living room and she told me it was going to be okay and I believed her. I want to tell you about the months that followed, because this is the part of the story that nobody tells. It was not triumphant. It was not a movie. There were mornings when I woke up in my new apartment and felt the specific ache of a life that has been reorganized against your chest, the absence of a familiar presence, even one that had not been good for you. There were evenings when I questioned myself, when I wondered if I had expected too much, asked for things that weren't reasonable, let my ambition crowd out something that could have been saved. And then I would go to work. I would sit in my new office, the one with the frosted glass and the little plant on the windowsill that my office manager had put there without being asked. And I would do the work that I had always done. And by the end of the day, the doubt would have settled back into whatever place it came from. My company's full acquisition was announced publicly in March. A press release put out by the acquiring firm, covered briefly in Business in Vancouver and a couple of national trade publications. The headline mentioned the deal value. It mentioned my name. It mentioned that I would remain with the company as creative director. I did not send my husband a link. I did not arrange for anyone to show it to him. I did not do anything at all. I found out, 6 weeks later, through my sister who had heard it from a friend we shared, that he had read the article. That someone at his office had forwarded it to him. The way people forward things when they believe you might not have seen them and are curious whether you have. I thought about what that moment must have felt like. The name he recognized, the number he hadn't known. The photograph of a woman he had been married to for 6 years, standing in a boardroom, looking like someone who had been standing in boardrooms for a very long time. I thought about it and then I let it go. Because here is the thing that those stories always get wrong, the ones where the woman engineers the perfect moment of revelation, where she watches his face fall and finds satisfaction in the falling. They frame the revelation as the point. The number on the wire transfer as the answer to the question of her worth. But I had known my worth long before any acquisition. I had known it at 2 a.m, revising a pitch deck for a client who would triple their conversion rate because of my work. I had known it in the 2nd bedroom of our Kitsilano apartment, building something methodical and patient and real while the television played in the next room. I had known it every time I had stayed quiet at a dinner party because explaining what I actually did felt like more effort than it was worth. The number didn't make me worth something. The number was just evidence for lawyers, for the acquiring firm, for a system that needs things expressed in units it recognizes. My worth had never been in question. Not to me. What had been in question was whether I was willing to keep living inside someone else's smaller idea of it. And the answer, I had finally understood, was no. A year after I moved out, my divorce was finalized on a gray Thursday morning in February. My lawyer called me at noon to confirm. I was in a client meeting. I stepped out to take the call, thanked her, went back inside. That night I made dinner for my sister and 2 friends, nothing elaborate. Pasta and a bottle of Okanagan Red I'd been saving, and we sat at my dining table in my apartment and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. We laughed more than I expected to. The evening went late. After they left, I washed the dishes and stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the city lights strung across the dark hills of the North Shore. I thought about the woman I'd been at that vineyard in the Okanagan, holding hands and dancing and believing so completely in the future she was stepping into. I wasn't angry at her. She had done what she knew to do. She had given generously and worked quietly and loved in the patient, sustaining way that women are taught to love, absorbing, accommodating, making herself smaller in the spaces where someone else wanted to feel large. I was grateful for what she'd built, even in the middle of a life that hadn't quite fit her. She had built it anyway. That was the part no one saw. Not my husband, not his colleagues, not the people at the dinner parties where he'd smiled and said, "Oh, she keeps herself busy." She had been building the whole time. There is a particular kind of silence that gets mistaken for absence. I know this now in a way I couldn't have articulated at that vineyard, holding wildflowers and trusting in the particular future I'd chosen. Silence is not the same as nothing. Sometimes, silence is the sound of someone who has already made up her mind and is simply waiting for the right moment to stand up and walk toward what she built. I walked toward mine. I'm still walking. And that, I think, is enough. If you're in it right now, if you know this particular kind of quiet, the kind that comes from being loved for a version of you that isn't quite true, I want to say something to you that I wish someone had said to me earlier. You do not owe anyone a performance of your worth. Not a dinner. Not a revelation. Not a perfectly timed moment where the number on a document finally convinces someone to see you clearly. You owe it to yourself to know your worth, to build without apology, to stop making yourself smaller in rooms where the ceiling was always high enough. And when the time comes, if the time comes to walk away quietly, with your work intact and your name on it, and let the world do the explaining. It will.